everyone. I'm really excited to be here. And when I got approached to give this talk, I figured what better way than to actually bring my world-class design team here so that we can actually all share our perspectives. So I'm going to briefly introduce everyone. I have Darrell, who's the head of design for our consumer, credit, and identity teams. Previously, Darrell was a design strategy for Intuit's Harmony design system. She's also led teams at eBay, Google, and Yahoo. She has also worked for key design agencies and ran her own consulting business. Next, we have John Helwig, who leads the design team responsible for PayPal's shared design system. He was also responsible for driving a complete overhaul of PayPal.com. John got his start in digital design when he built his first website at 16, selling snowboarding gear online, which quickly grew to more than 6 million in annual sales before being acquired. And then last but not least, we have Lauren Palmer, who's the head of user research at PayPal. She's also held research leadership positions at JPMorgan Chase and BlackBerry. Lauren has a long history of creative research expertise across industries, including work for Nike, Vodafone, Orange, and Pfizer, and has delivered research programs all over the world. Thank you guys for joining me here. A couple of things. One is I thought that a panel would help you guys get a little bit of diversity in thought so that you're not just getting my view. And then the other elephant in the room as well, now that you know everyone's bios, we've obviously worked at larger companies. So you might be wondering, how does this apply to us? But we're hoping that actually starting teams and growing teams isn't too different. And we're hoping that you can learn from our mistakes and our successes and apply that to the needs that you have. And with that, one of the things that I actually wanted to do was get to know you all a little bit as well. So how many of you are in companies that already have a designer or a design team? If you can, by show of hands, great. And then how many are looking to hire their first designer? Awesome, good distribution. And then in terms of your roles, anyone who's actually a designer or a researcher in the room? Excellent, a few of you. Anyone in PM? Engineering? Marketing? Awesome, awesome distribution. Any other functions that I didn't call out? Data science. Excellent. Good. Exciting. So this will be very interactive. I do have some questions that I'll be sort of kicking off the discussion with, but then raise your hands as you have questions or even comments that you want to add as well. We want to make it as interactive as possible. We also know that we're standing between you and lunch, so hopefully we'll make this interesting and collaborative here. So in terms of the first question that I actually had for the panel here, is our discipline can be really confusing just because we have so many sub-disciplines. So we have interaction design, we have visual design, we have information architecture, user research, content writers, content strategists, and the list goes on and on and on. So just to sort of set a baseline, I would love to go down the list and I'll start just talking about your backgrounds. I started as a visual interaction designer, so many, many years ago. And now in retrospect, I actually understand why I was given both roles, but that's also sort of what I studied back then, or at least the program I went to. There weren't specialties. So I have to say I wasn't an awesome graphic designer because that's not what I studied. I didn't learn like typography in detail, et cetera. I also didn't study HCI. It was a bit of a mix of the two, and as well as front-end development in my program. So even though we didn't have that label back then, I think in my first job I was what we now call a design unicorn. And it's interesting because I think some of these conversations are coming back again about hybrid designers, so we'll get to that later too. But before we get to that, Darrell, can you share a bit more about your background in terms of your specialty and where you started?
So I actually also started as a visual designer. I have a graphic design degree, and I did actually print work when I first started. But after grad school and being asked to make websites, I started really specializing in information architecture and interaction design. So a little bit of a hybrid, and I've been lucky enough to jump back and forth between actually being an individual contributor and being a hands-on designer, and then being a design leader, because I still like to make stuff.
Yeah. When I started with design, I called myself a web designer because that's what we did, was we built stuff for the web, and this was before apps and before a lot of these new sort of areas of design have emerged. So very generalist, and in building a website, it was really a buddy and I started. He was the engineer, I was the designer. wore a lot of hats, really did everything. And I didn't even know what to call a lot of these disciplines. You know, I know I was doing web design, but it really was covering the spectrum from journey mapping of what the user was going to be experiencing through this e-commerce journey, through UX and IA and a lot of these different disciplines, but very general. And then I would say from there, realized that my own passion as a designer was really in sort of the UI space, so really these interface design. And I went pretty deep there for a while and really focused on that. And then as I've progressed in my career, have again sort of generalized into understanding the array of disciplines. So I know we'll get more into this, but kind of go from broad to pretty focused and narrow and then back to more broad again.
So I have a slightly different background. I've focused in user experience research. So working as a researcher in a lot of organizations, I've actually been a team of one or a team of 2 or 3 and then had to grow a team up or actually introduced a discipline to some of the places I've worked. And so I was actually a psychologist by training, and I ended up working, helping early days in the world of mobile phone testing when mobile phone screens were black and white and small and you used a number keypad. And so we did a lot of testing, and I was just helping out, looking at the research results with the team. I was actually part of a different organization that did much more operational stuff. And bringing my psychology background into the role, there was a lot of discussion about, well, what do people want to do? You know, what's the psychology behind why they did this versus that? And I found that my psychology background was super helpful back in those early days when we didn't know why people or if people were going to use mobile phones. So I actually started working in really small teams, and I didn't join any large organizations or even a design team until about halfway through my career when research sort of moved into the design org in more and more of the companies I was working for. So my background's really just been in sort of growing user experience research in a lot of organizations. I've worked agency side where we were selling user research as a skill into a bunch of companies who wanted us to do design work. And then I've worked in-house for design teams where we have user research either as a growing new skill that we're trying to build into the organization or taking on a big team and trying to make sure that they're more effective and delivering better and better research, trying to up-level the research and have more strategic impact in the organization, which is something that's really picked up in the last few years.
Thank you. So I don't know if this helped or just made it even more muddled in terms of all the subspecialties in our field. And that's what I think has been interesting when I think about the last 2 decades that I've been working. As I mentioned, again, I think at least when I first started and it was more on the web, we had designers that did everything, and we were being asked to do everything from front-end development to doing visual interaction. When I moved to the Valley and I was working on software, then I was working with like real interaction designers that had studied HCI, and I was in complete awe of how much I didn't know. And as I was working with them, and we had visual designers that were doing icons, et cetera. And now I think probably in the last 5 to 6 years, I've seen, I think, a shift back to a little bit more of this full stack designer. I feel like schools are actually training people better to come out of design programs with that better breadth. And I think the other piece as well, as a leader, and I think as something that you probably all have to consider, it's really challenging. So even at PayPal, even though I have a team of 100, everyone is distributed in different product teams. So usually we actually just have one individual working on a product or a large project. And it becomes really hard for me to be having funding conversations when I say, hey, if you want design to be involved, you need to fund 5 of us. You need to fund a visual designer, an interaction designer, a content strategist, a content writer, a user researcher, et cetera. So it doesn't scale. It's not a model that scales. So we've definitely been looking more for this mixed skill set as we hire into the company and just really figuring out where are areas where we still need some level of specialty. But I'm curious to hear, from you, Darrell, your thoughts on this notion of the full stack or hybrid or T-shaped, to use some of the other terms being used to describe.
So, well, since I just described myself as having both skills or interaction and visual design skills, I think it's possible to find that. But my preference would be to have a really strong visual designer and a really strong interaction designer if my team was mature enough to have that level of specialty, because there's just nothing that beats somebody that has those skills, somebody that can really dive into the typography or the flow or micro interactions. However, if I was just starting a team and I didn't have a lot of budget, I would be looking for more of a generalist. But I think it's really important when you think about that generalist. Personally, I think you need stronger interaction skills than you need visual skills. You need to figure out how things work necessarily before you worry so much about how they look. And there's a lot of things that people can use to help somebody get their visual skills up to par, like having a design system and components that are already built, et cetera. So I would say, like, a typical designer answer is, it depends.
And actually, that's a great tie-in, John. I would love to get your thoughts on how, for instance, if you're at a startup, how might you think about a design system as one way that you could plug for that sort of not necessarily being able to hire, a visual designer and a UX designer, or interaction designer, and how that would apply and help someone scale beyond their core set of skills.
Yeah, that's a good point. I would say design systems are a great mechanism to scale. Even with small teams, you don't need a big function in order to build a design system. A lot of times it's really just a matter of whoever's doing the work initially, documenting what they're doing, and making it replicatable, making it something that the next person can build on, or as the team grows, they can build on. And I've seen this with big success with really small teams of even a single designer. So a lot of times, and this is a really important area where, especially as we go into new mediums, where an experience is no longer contained within one screen, just web, just app, just physical. It's crossing all these boundaries. So a design system is a way to create cohesion between those, both cohesion from screen to screen, also cohesion from online to offline. And so I think more and more design systems are a great way to, again, scale, actually create more value with the design system than you could just looking at each specific experience as an isolated unit.
A bit deeper into what a design system is and what it might include and how someone might go about getting started.
Yeah, and a design system can be really a whole slew of things, a spectrum of things. At PayPal, design system covers everything from the motion aspect of interactions, how things feel, how buttons interact, sort of the dimensionality of an experience, these sorts of things. So I would say sort of the rules of the experience. Also things like the actual patterns and components, the elements, the building blocks that can be reused. So really, generally it's reusable components, so it's things that you're going to be doing more than once. A lot of times if it is a bespoke, one-off aspect of an experience, it doesn't make sense to put the effort into documenting it. But if it's something that you're going to be doing again and again, or that multiple teams will be using, you then flag it and say, hey, this is an opportunity to document it and make it repeatable in that way. I think systems can also, if you look at the spectrum, at the basic level, it could be a brand design system where it's really just the aesthetic values, obviously the color palette, the typeface, those sorts of things that are really the style layer. And then as you go and as you build, then you get into more nuanced aspects, again, of how it works. And you guys obviously have seen things like Google's material design, great example of a design system that really sets a set of rules that determine how an experience feels to the user. And I think, in Google's case, it was because they had so many experiences that started to feel very different from one another. And yet people were using these different tools interchangeably. And so, why to compose an email in one experience is it completely different than, maybe the primary CTA of a calendar or something else. And so creating a common language, which is not just the visual language, but the actual experience language of where I expect to find different, elements of a tool or how it works, how it functions, that sort of thing, can really, I think, create a delightful experience.
Yeah, and I couldn't, by the way, I know this is a little bit off topic, but I actually feel when I think about Get Ninjas, the startup that I work with, that's one of the things that we tackled early on. And not only does it help you scale in terms of the kind of designer that you hire, but also in those projects or instances where you can't have a designer, having a design system means that you can end up with much more consistent experiences if the engineer is actually the one designing and building, or the PM is the one designing and building. It's also much easier to build that in than to later have to retroactively go in and update all of your experiences. It's a little hard to sometimes come up with patterns before you have enough of an experience, obviously, to understand what those patterns are. But I think just starting with some of those obvious things that you know you'll have can also be a great way of building design in early, which may not be the first thing that you're thinking about at an early stage company.
Yeah, the one other thing I'd add, because we have a good mix here, is the way that we look at design systems at PayPal is it's not just a design function, actually. We look at design system actually as a product at PayPal, which means we build it as a product. So we actually have product design engineering working together. And so these components, these repeatable components and patterns, we're actually coding them as a team. So that at the end of it, you actually have elements that can be plugged in both from the experience design, but then also knowing that there's a corresponding coded element at the other end. And so this creates a really good bridge between and synergy between designers and engineers, where in the old world, a designer would come first, they would design the experience and then hand it over, really throw it over the wall to the engineers and say, go build it. The engineers may or not be able to do it, technically speaking. Now, if you're building them sort of in unison simultaneously, you can know the designer knows what they have in their toolkit corresponds to what developers have, and so everything they build, they know can be actually developed and launched in that way.
All right, shifting gears a little bit, if you guys were starting your own company, who would be your first UX hire? And Lauren, we'll have you go first. I'm really curious to know your answer coming from a research background.
Out of order. So I would, so my first design hire would be probably a designer who recognizes the value of research and has had some hands-on experience in delivering it. So it's like the ultimate hybrid designer for me is somebody who is motivated by understanding the customer, has a passion for delivering an experience that a customer will want to use, and whether or not they have delivered that research, they have that expectation of their role, and that's what they'll bring to their design function. Because I actually believe very strongly that research and design work better together all the time, and I've always wanted to work in design teams, and the people who are the most successful in delivering the best experiences are the designers who understand the value of the customer and can bring that lens to what they do. So, surprise, I would not actually hire a researcher first in my own company where I was doing that.
John?
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I think customer, what I'd call like a customer champion, someone that is really bringing in that customer perspective of the user, a designer that's willing to roll up their sleeves, get in, do their own research, go out and talk to people on the street, and then bring that in. A lot of times I would say when you look at this model of what PayPal would call 3 in a box, which is product, design, engineering working together, they each bring unique perspectives, and I think the perspective a designer can and should bring is that of really the customer expectation. From an experience perspective, which can then be matched with really the technical capabilities or expectations of the product that's being built. So really, I would say a generalist. So back to the conversation. I mean, if you have one designer, it needs to be someone that can do everything. It's not going to help if you have a really strong icon designer that knows nothing about UX or IA. So someone that can really see, and I'd say someone that feels ownership of the product, so not just of the individual piece of work that they're doing, but that feels sort of a shared commitment to the product experience. And so looking for that, really that connection point, I would say, is going to make a huge difference in a first hire.
Or are you going to be competing for the same?
I'm competing for the same person, but I will add that I think we also have to think about folks' soft skills, and especially if you're thinking about the first hire, you need somebody that can do all sorts of facilitation and discuss the trade-offs of features versus business impact and what's going to happen between a user need or a business need. And so in addition to the traditional designer toolkit, I actually think that you need this range of communication skills, negotiation skills,
definitely facilitation, and just an overall willingness to jump in and get your hands dirty and not have a power struggle over, well, that's not my job, because it's everybody's job.
Or that's only my job.
Or that's only my job. I think one of the biggest things that I had to learn in this world was it doesn't really matter where a good idea comes from. If it's a good idea, we should go for it. And everybody has an opinion on design, so why not listen to that rather than get all territorial?
Very true. And we'll get into, go ahead.
How do you vet that out?
We'll jump into that question. And actually, that was one of the questions that I had, which is how do we assess talent during the interview process? I think both in terms of the technical and design skills, but also I think some of those soft skills, which I think is your question.
So this is kind of controversial. There are people who don't actually believe this, but we do look at portfolios, at least to give us some baseline to go on. But I really look to the explanation of how they do the work. I want to hear them tell me a story about their role on the project or what they did and why they did it and how they worked with the rest of the team. And a lot of times that'll give me a really good indication of their other skills, not just their design skills. Are they a team player? Were they part of a large team and they had a teeny role, but they're saying, I did this. And at PayPal and at many other companies that I've worked at, we do a design exercise on the spot. It's not a take-home, and it's not related to, it's not something, a piece of work that we're going to pick up and use, but we give folks about 45 minutes to solve a problem on a whiteboard or whatever they choose. And this is really interesting to me because this helps us think about not just their design process, but how well do they respond under pressure? How articulate are they? Are they mad that we're asking them to do this? And it can really make the difference between saying yes to a candidate or no to a candidate. However, there are people in the industry that think this is a really bad thing. So, but I actually think it's really valuable.
Yeah, it's generally common practice to do the design exercises, even though, when you're on the receiving end, it can definitely be intimidating. We've all been there. But I think some of the things that Darrell mentioned around articulate that it's more about their thought process and how they actually present their idea, the questions that they ask of you, more so than obviously the end result of what you're going to get at, in a 45-minute slot. I think that can help remove some of that. I think the other thing too, both during the presentation but during one-on-one interviews, I think asking behavioral questions, and especially I think asking for those questions of, tell me about a time when you disagreed with a PM. How did you go about it? What was it? What was the outcome? I think can really help to tease out whether or not someone can be open-minded. Can they be collaborative? Are they territorial about the role that they feel like that design should play? Or are they going to be someone who actually embrace ideas from many different venues, et cetera? So really make sure that you're asking for those examples. Because I think you can read a lot through it, and during the presentation as well, I think you can listen to some of those cues. It's amazing, and a service I think to our industry that sometimes I think the way that that a designer may come in and tell a story, you can tell that they actually have a lot of negative energy about how a project went down. So you can probe into that later, and sometimes there's a really great reason, and sometimes there's a red flag there about how someone might approach their work and the fact that they're not collaborative and they're not a team player. So think about sort of that 360 of both them telling the story of the work and their journey, showing an end-to-end project. So we ask people to show breadth of projects and then to take one project and actually show it end-to-end and explain trade-offs and challenges, et cetera. Then we do the design exercise, and then we do one-on-one interviews that definitely are very behavioral focused. And we decide ahead of time what are those attributes that we actually care about, like collaboration, like customer focus, so that each person is focusing on one of those elements in their interview. And that I feel like has actually resulted in fairly good hires or a good success rate. Anything else you guys would add in terms of how do you get at those soft skills?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because on the research side, we see it. So one of the things that we do at PayPal is we involve many people across the organization in design in the interview process. So our researchers go to the design candidate interviews and vice versa, which I find super helpful because you get the customer or the partner that those people are going to have to work with in that process, which really helps. And with researchers, we've really pushed people to start thinking about their end presentation. With researchers, we used to spend a lot of time testing their moderation skills, but actually if they're at a certain point in their career, you kind of want to rely on those moderation skills and you want to be able to see how somebody can present and tell a story in the same way that we are expecting a designer to be able to do that so that they can work together. So it's not that we do anything, it's not additive to what anybody said previously, but I do think that advantage is, when you've got the whole team involved in the interviewing and hiring process, you're getting a much better perspective of how successful that candidate will be when they come into the organization. And if you've got specific foibles in your organization, there are particularly strong characters or there are particular pain points in the process, being upfront and talking to candidates about how they will respond in those situations so that you don't end up only finding that once you've gone through the rigmarole of onboarding people. So we're quite open in our interview process and we challenge people about difficult situations and ask for those examples, as Daniela says, so we can see those proof points before we onboard them.
No, that's a great point. So our interview panel is cross-functional. So we include the individuals that this designer will be working with. There's always someone from PM, generally someone from engineering, and it's generally just to also assess for fit and chemistry, right? I think that's just as important. You need to, the whole team, the whole Trina Box team needs to walk away feeling like that's someone that they would enjoy working with. Go ahead.
Do you guys feel like the UX experience research approach is a little bit different for B2C versus B2B products? And if so, what is that difference?
I don't think that the process is different. I think there are definitely challenges that are different depending on who you're talking to, but the overall process fits in both places. So we have, consumer-facing teams, we have merchant-facing teams, and we have LE teams, large enterprise teams, and small business teams. So even within the merchant or the B2B space, we've still got a range of different customer types, and we apply the same methodology. We just have to be mindful of specific things, like it's really tough to get to speak to LEs. It's really difficult to get SMBs to give up time in an already hopelessly busy day. So we apply the same process. We're just mindful of how that might need to be flexible according to the target that we're talking to. From a design perspective, I think it may be similar.
I agree. I think there's a tendency when you're building something to look at the audience as segments or sort of functional parties, but they're all people, right? So they're actually, even if you're a merchant, you may skew more towards wanting the data and wanting the facts and those sorts of things, but you're still going to react viscerally to an experience as a human. And oftentimes what you find with merchants actually is that they use things like data to validate an emotional decision that they've already made. So.
Yeah, I think on the business side, I'd just quickly add, one of the interesting things is there's an assumption that if the system is a B2B system, that we don't need to worry as much about the experience because the customer either has to use it or the end user has to use it based on an executive decision. So I actually feel like some of those projects are the ones where you need to invest more because you've got to be really spot on and really efficient in how you deliver that experience. And the assumption that just because it's a more difficult target from some people's perspective or a more professional target, they'll know how to use it, is an assumption that you should be careful of too.
And I think expectations, as you all know, preaching to the choir, I think the expectations of enterprise users have changed. Right now, we all have iPhones, and we all expect the same, I think, level of user experience, even from the tools that we're using as business users, if you will. I think the other benefit that you have too is I think in thinking through recruiting, you have hopefully the benefit of being a lot closer to your sales team. Like for instance, at PayPal, it might take us several email threads to figure out who's the salesperson that we should work with to have access to those accounts. For you guys, hopefully it's a little easier, but also think about other kind of channels of recruiting and getting access to those participants, but also knowing, and this is a very old cliche, so you may all know this already, but also thinking that the people they're working with may not be the end users of your product, so making sure that you're actually reaching and researching those end users, not necessarily the ones who are making the purchasing decisions for the tools. So just a few more variables that you need to consider when trying to reach those participants. Go ahead.
So we have a bit of a different perspective because we are very small and don't have full-time designer. So I think there are probably a lot of other companies in the room that are in a similar space, or maybe not in the room that act through. So for companies who are in that place, maybe they have some front-end engineers who have design sense, and they have some design mocks that they commission from somebody. What advice, practical advice, would you give in terms of finding good design resources, potentially hiring one designer, and what kind of designer, but maybe this is less important, and like places they can go for resources that aren't, they don't have a lot of money to throw at having something commissioned for them, or having a full-time person on staff who just creates like branding illustrations, icon sets, without looking extremely generic, like they just pick a foundation or bootstrap on.
Yep, no, great question. And I'll broaden it a little bit and we'll make sure that we answer your question as well. So in the last 6 to 8 months, this team actually collectively hired about 50 new employees into our PayPal team and just as many contractors. So if you could share maybe some of this, and it's a very competitive landscape, as some of you probably know. It's really hard to actually attract talent, to find talent and attract talent. A lot of competition for good design talent. So if you could talk about some of the strategies that you use to finding people, and I think specifically then answering about, maybe you can't get a whole person, what are some other strategies that you have also used?
So I, as many people do, started with my network. I reached out to people I had worked with before, and I asked if they were not interested. I asked them to make recommendations. This helped a lot. I got some of my first hires were through recommendations, or in one case, somebody I had worked with previously.
And just one thing on that, the other thing too is, because you may not have the same network that we have, some of our best recommendations actually come from an engineer who works with a great designer, which is awesome because then we know they're actually someone that works well with others. So don't feel like it needs to be limited, right? Ask other engineers, product managers, et cetera, which designers have they worked with that they really liked. It's one of the best ways of actually finding the right people.
There are also there are actually a couple of job boards that people look at here in the Valley. There's Bakai, there's an IXD, the Interaction Design Association job board, and those actually are pretty good. I know people who check those fairly regularly. And again, we have the resources of some sourcers. So one of the things that I typically do just to get my network going is that even if folks aren't necessarily interested in a job now, I still make contact with them and take them to coffee and get to know them. And so there's always sort of folks on the edge of, well, maybe for my next job, I'll be looking towards you. So these are a lot of different strategies. But when I haven't had the resources to actually hire a designer, a lot of people might say, well, go look on Dribbble. There's a couple of other sites whose name escapes me just right now. But the thing I would say about that is something pretty doesn't mean that you're a good designer just because you have one example of something pretty. I always see people online critiquing somebody's app or website, but what they don't really know is what were the goals of that design and who were they trying to reach and what was the timing and who was building it. There's so many questions that are unanswered that you need to probe, even if you see a design that you think is really helpful. And the last thing I'll say is that if you see an app or design that you think is really good, try to find who did it and reach out to that person, because even if they aren't available, they have other designer friends. Every designer I know has friends who are designers, and it's a community that people know, vaguely know who's around and who's looking.
Yeah, just one thought, and specifically on that, I think it's a really good point that a lot of people run into. One is, just because you don't have a designer doesn't mean you can't apply design thinking. And I think design thinking has gotten a bit of a bad rap, which is like, think like designer. That's not really what it is. It's more like apply these principles and methods of thinking through the customer experience, doing the research, those sorts of things. You can apply those methods without a designer, a full-time designer. In the same way that a designer should roll up their sleeves and understand code and the engineering environments, I think other roles can also understand design. I'm not trying to get myself out of a job here, but it's not voodoo magic, right? It's some some principles, it's some things that you can apply, and then find those things that, to your point, you don't want to go grab a generic icon set. Find the things that are going to be differentiating for the experience and invest in that aspect. And there's plenty of sources for freelance. And the other thing is, you guys are probably working on some really exciting things. There's going to be people that would do it as a passion project, a side thing, that invest a little bit of their time to help out. So obviously the goal would be to scale to the point where you can have a full-time design function. You can certainly get a lot done without that, and as you build.
That's a great point. And even the advisor role, for instance, that I've played with Get Ninjas, I think that's another way as well that you can actually get. I think a lot of people are interested in, they may work at large companies, but be interested in the cool stuff that you all are working on. So that's another route, I think, as well, in terms of not only getting that expertise, but they can also help you hire. So something that can always be thought of. Anything?
I won't steal any more question time. I think maybe we'll give people a chance.
All right. So we'll start in the back since you raised your hand first.
Can you speak more about establishing a design process, especially when the team is moving from a small team to a large team in a fast-moving startup environment?
Sure, absolutely. Do you want to take that one, Lauren?
Yes. So I have started teams that I was hired in as the UX person, and mostly for research, which at the time was always about understanding the customer generally. So it was also just, we don't even have a market research team. Our marketing team's only 3 people. So, can you help us put in design thinking? And to the point that we were talking about earlier, I think that the principles that John mentioned and the design process is something that's actually relatively simple. It's a few good steps, and if you can demonstrate the value of those steps into your organization, then you will get buy-in and people will be interested in understanding how you can advance the thinking. To John's point previously as well, I think one of the things that we do at PayPal is we've really tried to democratize the disciplines so that it's not just about the designer having an opinion about design and then the researcher talking about research. We involve everybody in that journey. So we take engineers and product managers and people on research trips. We sit with the designers and we involve multiple people in the critiques and the design reviews we do. So that ability to spread the love of design thinking around the organization and get organizational buy-in was really the key to getting any process in place. And I think there are many resources out there that really simplify, the 5 stages of design thinking and, the way that you can use it in your organization, and getting everybody to do it is actually the best medicine. It's amazing when you show people that if we do great research at this point in the process, we don't spend 10 weeks usability testing it and fixing things at the end. No CEO in the world is going to say, oh, okay, no, I prefer to spend 10 weeks at the end fixing what I built already. So that's the way that I've used it.
And there are a couple of, obviously the process is much longer, but there are a couple of pieces of the process that we're really trying to scale at PayPal that I can share since it's not a secret sauce. But one of the pieces is what we call problem discovery. So how do you go and actually do that research to understand what customer problems you're solving for? And I think to Lauren's point, I think the more that you can actually involve the full team in that process, the better it is, because everyone actually works with a sense of that empathy and an understanding of the problem that they're trying to solve for, as opposed to, which helps later if one person is getting too attached to a solution, you can always go back to, but remember the problem is this, and we all saw it with our own eyes and felt it, et cetera. So doing things like everything from customer interviews to actually visiting them at, doing contextual inquiry, et cetera, up front to understand the problems. At PayPal specifically, because we are quite global, we actually try to also distill those down to common themes that may apply globally. which I think can also fit for like platform teams and other teams that are trying to figure out how do you then prioritize all of those problems? How do you distill it down to the ones that the team is going to be going forward and solving? And then we do something called solution discovery. It's not dissimilar to a design sprint, if anyone has read the book or heard about Google Ventures Design Sprint, where again, you lock everyone in a room, and what the intent there is to really brainstorm a broad range of ideas and put those in front of customers and quickly narrow into the one that you then want to go and prototype in a higher fidelity and further validate before you build it, but doing it very quickly. I think design sometimes will expand to take however much time you give the process. So really trying to narrow that down, or at least that discovery phase, into a couple of weeks if you can, or even 5 days, as with the design sprint model, is really key. And it's one way that we can not invest a lot of time down a path if it's not the right path once you get in front of customers.
I'm curious on your views on organizationally where design can fit and work with marketing, product, and engineering. I've been various startup companies where the center of gravity is in one place or the other, and there's real trade-offs there. So I'm wondering, what's optimal, especially in large small companies where a lot of us are. Where does that design person sit? They roll up to how they work across teams, given that there's lots of demands for design.
Yeah, we could probably fill the rest of the time just on that topic alone. And I've myself reported into every function. I've reported into marketing. I've reported into engineering. I've reported into product. I've been a peer to all of those organizations. It really varies. And I think you're right. I actually think that in an ideal world, and this is the designer's ideal world, of course, we're all reporting to the CEO, but that's unrealistic in many cases. But so in a world where design can't be a peer to all of those functions, I think actually being in the function that is the center of gravity for where those customer decisions get made is, to me, the most appropriate setup. If that makes any sense. So when I've been in companies where product management made all of those decisions and we reported into there, that really helped, because that's where design could be that catalyst for challenging some assumptions and helping with product strategy, et cetera. In companies that were more marketing oriented and I reported into marketing, that also helped, since obviously marketing was the one who was really acting as the customer champion in the company. So at least for me, that's my answer. If anyone has a different perspective?
No, I agree. I would say this is one of those sort of universal problems of there's no perfect organizational structure. And I think at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily matter. I think there's an interesting model, and especially once you get to a large scale like PayPal, where you have sort of multiple spectrums happening simultaneously. And what I mean by this is Spotify had a great model of this, of sort of scaling teams around. It's really agile, right? But they have product squads, which are like the actual Scrum teams, where you have all the disciplines needed to build a product. And that's product, engineering, design, and they're really focused around problem solving and creating something. But you also have you can have tribes, which is a larger sort of function, and neither of those are organizational. Meaning, people that make up the squad and the tribe don't necessarily organizationally ladder up to the same leaders, and that's where you get into things like guilds, right? Where things like design as a guild can be all over the place in terms of where they sit day to day and solving those customer problems. And that's a lot of what we do. And Daniela spoke to it earlier, where there may be one designer that sits on a product team, over here working on a feature, and even though organizationally they're part of the design guild, day to day they're really working alongside their partners in that Scrum team in that way. And really, to that point, I think it's about co-ownership of that. That there isn't, there's obviously the product owner role, which has a set of responsibilities of leading that product initiative, but really co-ownership of what the vision is, and having design as a part of that thinking throughout the entire process from start to finish and through the iterations.
Yeah, no, that's a really great, and at PayPal we actually have a mix of it, I would say. So at PayPal, because we do have scale, we generally have design somewhat centralized where we can, so that they have career development and coaching, et cetera, from someone from their tribe, if you will. But John, for instance, he doesn't report solid line to me, but he is dotted line and part of the design guild and part of my extended staff. We have other teams that also don't report into me, but we meet as a community. But then even more important than that, because that will always naturally happen, I feel like, is making sure that design is as embedded, and as integrated into the product and engineering teams that they're working with, so that they're not working in a silo in a vacuum. So it's that happy medium. I always joke that, design is the family that my team was born into, and then the teams that they work with is the one that they marry into, and they always should feel like they have a little bit of a foot in both. And sometimes even those healthy tensions of, should I attend this staff meeting or this staff meeting? I want them to actually feel like they belong to both and have loyalty to both. I'll let you go, just since I know you had your hand raised.
How do you handle doing user testing if the product is moving like really fast? Like people always want to say like, oh, we gotta fix this bug before we can let people test, or like that thing should be in, or this, and like you end up just never doing it because there's always like one more thing you want in before you have to like user feedback.
So hire your participants on set days, and if your team is working super fast, like every other day, have participants come in every other day, and then tell the team that those people are coming in, and whatever's ready should be tested, and also have them asked by their teams, did you test that? And if you have it set up so that it's already there, then the worst thing that can happen is those participants arrive and they get $50 for doing nothing, which nobody hates. So having it preset and then just being able to say, there's people downstairs right now, go talk to them, it really gets the muscle moving. And then what happens is people rely on the sessions coming, and you may only have set them up for a couple of weeks, and then people go, why have we still not got customers coming in? It's really great because I've made all these decisions really fast. So that's the way that we do it, is we really want to push a team. We just hire the customers and we say, your people are coming in on Thursday, they'll be here, you need to speak to them, and everyone will find something to put in front of them.
Yeah. I'd say don't make it optional. I think research is just a part of the process. It has to be. I'd say also look at research not as validation of something you've already built, but as an input into it. And so, what we do is we have insights or research happening really, really early in the process, and it's really a required step because I don't think it's optional.
Yeah, which is a great point. You may, the team may be thinking through the solution. You could still just go and talk to those customers and not even have something to show to them. You'll still walk away with more information that can then feed into that process than if you don't talk to customers. So I think if you remove that friction by having participants there, that's number one. Number two, use that as, don't feel like you need to bring finished product or something that's already built to put in front of them. I think just even having that conversation will be better than not talking to customers at all.
Can you give those of us who are adding our first or second or third designer or researcher tips on how to onboard that person, bring them up to speed as fast as they can?
Thank you.
Legacy, horrible interactions, over the library, and kind of the range of our experience.
So John, I'll give you that one. It was actually one of our questions that we skipped, so thank you.
I'd say one is empower them to learn on their own. I think the biggest thing you can do is just give them the opportunity to self-teach, right? Because I think, especially when you're moving quickly, and if you're a small team, you don't have time for everyone to take a huge part of their time to go train this person. And so if they have the mentality of learning, they can get in and they can work alongside people. It's going to be sort of an organic onboarding that happens over time. I would say that's probably the biggest thing that I've seen. And I've seen two examples of two designers that have come in at the same time, one with the mentality of sort of learning and the other without, and just seeing the massive difference in how well they were able to integrate and how effective they were able to be as a part of the team was just night and day between the two.
I would also say that you can do a little work to help them on board by kind of creating a new employee or a new designer kit. Like, here's all the links to the stuff you need, here's the software we use, here's our fonts. Just make it easy for them to find what they need to get up to speed. And then I like to do a little bit of a pair design with the other members of the team for a couple of days so that they like sort of shadow that person and sit with them and work with them so they see what it's like. It doesn't have to go on really long, but it'll give them an intro to all the meetings people are going to. PayPal is a huge meeting culture. So they want to make decisions as to, should I go here, should I not go here? Who are the people I'm talking to on my team? Who are the PMs, engineers, et cetera?
And I think the last thing too is don't narrow the information that you think they will need to just things that you may think are design relevant. So I would say whatever you might be actually telling your PMs and engineers, sort of use some of that and make sure that the designer has access to that too. Everything from strategy to how do I get a test account to how. So think more broadly about what they might need as well, because I think that that's one of the things. Sometimes I think designer would just get a narrow slice of all of the functions and what everyone is doing in the company. So think broadly as well, and then let them dig deeper into the areas that will be more relevant.
One tiny add to that, which is that we have used in our team a first 30 days deck. Like, it was that simple. We had a first 30 days PowerPoint slide, and it's like, these are the people in your team. These are the people who your manager reports to. These are the people who you might want to, and it's like super simple. Lunch gets served at this time if you're lucky enough to have catered lunch. I never have, by the way. It's just always a good point. But like anything that you think.
Her, by the way, just.
Sorry?
I'm joking. Clearly, that's a pain point for her.
Yeah, I would love to have some free lunch, please. But, you know, just really simple stuff, you know, like if you need your badge activated or you lose your laptop, and just having all of that in one place. And what you find is that becomes a document that builds over time, and as people learn. And what I would do is actually give it to somebody who's just onboarded and say, write this deck out and fill in all the things we never told you. And then we'll go back and answer those questions, and that can be our kind of living document that becomes a reference material. I've even seen nice ones with little pictures of the team, you know. These are the people who work in, you know, Shanghai, who you'll never see, but, you know, they're real people and they're on your DL, so you should be connecting with them.
Then if you can as well, I think having them do sort of a cognitive walkthrough of your product is another great way of helping them ramp up and onboard. Better yet, if you can actually then have them also do something with users and maybe run sort of a light end-to-end assessment of your product, or do interviews if you don't have a product yet, I think is another great way where they will learn way faster, even if it means that maybe it's taking them a week to do that. So I would highly recommend it before they go native. Have them do that where they still have fresh eyes.
You mentioned giving people across the organization a voice is really critical to the design process and getting organizational buy-in. Are there any other tips or strategies for that you found successful in getting that organizational buy-in? Like from like other team members, and acknowledging design as a very crucial step in the process, and kind of leading by design without design by committee. Where does that fall?
I've actually found that to have the most influence, I kind of need both a bottoms-up effort and a top-down effort. So that if I had some sort of executive champion to talk about the value of what I was doing or my particular project, that helped me gain access to the other people in the organization that I might need to influence. And I think it's really, really important for us, whatever you're trying to talk about, that we have a really, really great story that is backed up by what is the customer benefit and what are the analytics, and really, really tell your story in the language that the people you're trying to influence understand. So I would never start talking about our app and the fact that we changed the color blue because of accessibility to our executives. I might say we changed the visual design so that we would get more clicks on this important area, right? You want to really tailor your message to the people that you're talking to. And I have done what I used to call a dog and pony show, which is, here's the thing I'm trying to get backing for. I've got a nice story and a deck, and I'm just going to ask, can I come to your staff meeting and share it? And I'm going to go around the whole company so that it starts being something that people talk about.
I think the other thing too is playing a facilitator role, I find can also be quite effective in terms of being included and invited to meetings that you might not otherwise, because they may not think it's a design discussion. So I think if you can apply your facilitator skills that generally come naturally just because of the kind of process that we need to drive, that's another way. And I feel like it's one way that then people start thinking of you as someone who can help actually bring everyone together and have all of the voices heard, as I think Lauren mentioned earlier, and helping to synthesize and to represent the customer, et cetera. That can be also quite effective.
What things do you bring up in a performance review for a designer?
So I'll just jump in there, not because I run a design team, but because I think we all believe the same thing, which is some people are very driven by the number of things that they did, the number of projects they worked on, the number of meetings they went to, et cetera, et cetera. And I've been in performance reviews where people have told me, I spoke to 5,000 customers this year, and I ran 458 projects. And we really tried to focus on the impact that you had. So if you, as a designer or as a researcher, can demonstrate the impact that your involvement in the project had, then that's what I care about in your performance review, because I think that shows value to the company, development of your own personal skills, and your ability to actually affect change. So we've had a lot of conversations about this internally. What do we want to value in design, and what we want to coach our staff to do. You never want that to be a surprise. You don't want to get to the end of the year and say, oh, I was really testing you on impact and you didn't have any. Sorry. You want people to know that that's what you're looking for, and then be able to coach them to get that in their projects, and try and get away from that. Oh, I did this many wireframes, I did this many meetings, I did this many sessions.
I think we need to talk about feedback as an ongoing conversation that you have with your teams all the time, and that it's mostly positive encouragement, not necessarily always criticism, and the fact that you really can get to know your team, and they feel, everybody should read Radical Candor, and have a really deep conversation with your team about where they want to go and what their skills are, et cetera, so that by the time a performance review comes around, nothing is a big shock. Everybody knows where they are.
So we're constant. We do design reviews, so people are getting feedback about the actual work in weekly design reviews. And then by having one-on-ones, et cetera, I think that's where you then touch on more of the soft skills and some of those impact questions, and have more of those deeper discussions. Avoid, hopefully by the time that your performance review comes in, is just summarizing all of those conversations that you've been having.
I will also say that if there is some sort of critical issue that comes up that you really need to give feedback to somebody in the moment, the closer you do it to the moment, the better. I actually was in a meeting once with my really big boss, and I said something, and the minute I said it, I knew it was the wrong thing to say. And she didn't say anything then, but as soon as we stepped out of the meeting, she said, hey, Darrell, next time maybe you should think about what you say before. And she was right, but it was in the moment, so I understood the feedback. It wasn't 2 weeks later coming from a third party.
I think for one more question.
Do you have any strategies for working with remote teams, especially like design reviews?
I don't know.
Highly remote team.
I have teams in many, many places. So I think both teams have to give in terms of when you can. I have a team in Tel Aviv, I have a team in Bangalore. They're all different time zones. So all of us have to make adjustments in our schedules. I say use as much video as you can so that you're seeing people's faces and not just talking on the telephone or on a screen. We've had a lot of success with actual remote brainstorming sessions using some tools. That has been really great to get everybody on the same page. And then if you have budget, I would say that once in a while some travel, seeing people in person makes a huge difference. I just came back from my team in Tel Aviv, and I built way great relationships just by seeing them in person and meeting with them.
Yep. So for things like the solution discovery or design sprints, for instance, that is one place where we will try to get everyone in the same location, especially with customers, budget, permitting. And then I think the other thing that we do try to do, even though Darrell's team is highly remote, they're generally co-located with their PM and engineers. So that has also been something that is critical. As much as possible, we try to co-locate them. So not all of design is in one location, but they are with the people that they work with on a day-to-day basis. For the most part, it's not perfect. We still have teams in various locations, but that it is challenging when you do such tactical work as design, tangible work as design to be remote. But
I've also set up things like a really good wiki page so other people can see what's going on, so that there's a way to share what's happening in the community without you actually being there. Or we have our share outs at a time where most people can dial in so that they can actually see what's going on. So we really think a lot about the communication with those remote teams.
think also if there's a way to focus on more project-based work as opposed to task-based. So to Danielle's point, right, the more that they can be sort of autonomous and working on something with ownership around it, as opposed to, okay, I've done my task and I'm now gonna pass that one thing over, that can feel very sort of disconnecting. But if they feel empowered that they're running something, then it doesn't really matter if they're necessarily here in the main campus or somewhere else.
All right, I think we're at time. If you have any questions for us, we can hang out here for a few minutes, but also you can find us on Twitter or LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out, and thank you for your interaction.